Welcome to the Multi-Board Residential Real Estate Contract 7.0 tutorial. We will be going through the contract, and as we do that, we will be talking about every paragraph, spending a little more time on the paragraphs that are more relevant to us as the realtors. I will go through the paragraphs that are more there for the attorney's use, but not spend quite as much time on those. So let's get started. The first paragraph is the parties. So we have to put in the buyer's name and we have to put in the seller's name. So you as the buyer agent will be the one that will be initially writing up this contract 99.9% of the time. So you will obviously know your buyer's names. You will put their names in as they will be holding title. So it won't be Mr. and Mrs. Jones. It would be Sally K. Jones and Jack C. Jones or whatever it might be. The seller's name you should be able to get from the MLS. If it is not in the MLS, it will be in Realist. So when you go into Realist, the seller's names are there. If by some chance you cannot locate the seller's names at all, it is recommended that you put in, do not take up the whole line for this, just put in to be inserted, small enough that you can read it, but giving room in there to put the seller's name. If you leave it blank, then when the seller's names are put in, it becomes a counter offer because it would need initials. If you put to be inserted, you're allowing that to be inserted without creating a counter offer situation. But that should only be on rare occasion. As I said, the vast majority of the time you will have the buyer's, the buyer's names, and you will be able to determine the seller's names. If you are a dual agent in this transaction, that means that you are representing both the buyer and the seller. Oh, now, by the way, you absolutely have all of their names, but you would check here and you will be completing one of the optional paragraphs. We are going through the contract in order. So we're not jumping to that paragraph here. We will talk about it when we get there. But this allows both parties to know that you are acting as a dual agent right up front, which is what, in fact, the license law requires us to do. So that's basically paragraph number 1. Paragraph number 2 is the real estate. This is what is it that we are selling. So it starts with the approximate lot size or acreage of, and again, that is available through the MLS. So you should be able to find in there what the lot size or the acreage is, and it says approximate. The only time, so you don't need to worry about it being exact, it's whatever's in the MLS. The only time that you might want to do anything with this, so just a reminder as we get started, we are not supposed to make, we as realtors are not supposed to be making any kind of modifications to this contract. We're not supposed to be practicing the law without a license, but the simple modification that I'm going to mention to you now would only be done if, in fact, your buyer was only going to purchase this property if it had a minimum acreage of. So let's just say he was going to buy this property and he has 4 horses. And wherever this property is located, you have to have 1 acre of land to have a horse. I'm making that up. I don't know. It's going to be different every place. We're in horse country. So he needs 4 acres or he can't have all 4 of his houses. So if you leave this with the real estate with approximate lot size or acreage of 4 acres, if it comes back slightly less than 4 acres, you could end up with an argument as to whether or not the buyer still has to purchase this property and get rid of one of his horses. So we don't want that to happen. So the real estate with, and you would cross out the word approximate. So you would cross out the word approximate, and in the blank, you would write not less than 4 acres. So if you had a buyer who was did not want to purchase the property without it being 4 acres, it would be with lot size or acreage of not less than 4 acres. And that would cover you. That's not going to happen very often. It's going to happen with horses. It's going to happen if, in fact, a developer wanted to buy a 4 acre plot of land with a house on it. We would sell that with this contract. And he would want, and let's say it was 1 acres, it was zoned for 1 acre lots. He needs 4 acres, otherwise it's not worth as much to him if it's only 3 acres, so, or 3.5. So just an example of when you might have to do that. Next is the address of the property, no big deal. The permanent index number or numbers, some of the properties have more than one PIN. You're going to want to put them both in there if that be the case. Most properties have just one PIN. That is also in the MLS, so you can get it from there. You'll then check to say whether this is a single family attached or detached or a multi-unit building. This is so that everybody knows what other documents we may be looking for in this transaction. So a single family attached, such as a condo or a townhouse or a et cetera, are going to have all kinds of condo docs that we're going to need. If it's multi-unit, we've got some other issues that we need to take a look at. So it's all of that kind of stuff, what we're going to be looking for. If designated parking is included, then you're going to put in the number of spaces that the buyer gets with this property and the space numbers and where they are located. Are they in the parking lot? Are they in the garage? Where are they at? And is this deeded space? And if it is, there will be a PIN for the parking space. Is it a limited common element or is it assigned space? Odds of you having either one of those, either the designated storage or the designated parking, checked off and used in a single family detached is not going to happen because there is no designated parking and designated storage. It's going to happen in your multi-unit more likely than anything else. If you are not going to use it, we're not supposed to leave any blanks in the contract to be filled in later. So I suggest rather than drawing lines in there, just put N/A in that very first line on first space on line 11, N/A. And now everybody knows we're not using either of those, designated parking or designated storage. So just NA in a blank makes sense because it doesn't look like you left it blank to go back and put stuff in there later. Just a couple of suggestions on paragraph 2. Paragraph 3 is the fixtures and personal property paragraph. And it is where we specifically state to the seller what they need to be leaving in the property and what the buyer wants the seller to leave. Now, we also will use this paragraph to tell the buyer that the seller is taking some things. And I'm going to walk you through that and show you how that works. But before I even do that, I want to remind you that the sales contract supersedes what's in the MLS. So if I had put a listing in the MLS and I had said that my seller was leaving the washer and dryer and all the window treatments and hardware, and you did not check off washer, dryer, and all the window treatments and hardware, my seller would not have to leave them. So it is imperative that you as a buyer agent make sure you have checked off in this part of the contract everything that your buyer wants left. It is inappropriate and a major mess if you take the lazy way out and just check everything on all 4 of those columns. That's not how it's done. You need to know what the buyer wants. You need to check off what they want, and then the listing agent needs to go through this carefully with their seller to make sure that everything that is checked off is agreeable to the seller. Because when we get to the closing table, the last thing I want to see happen is either the listing agent or the buyer agent having to buy or pay for some of this stuff because you didn't take care of it when you wrote the contract. Because the flip side of this is if you check off washer and dryer and my seller had not planned on leaving it, we get to the closing, my seller needs to provide a washer and dryer because it was in the contract. So this becomes the agent's responsibility. This is not the attorney's responsibility to do this. So you want to make sure that you are very careful about what goes in, what you check off. And it says, if you'll notice in line 18, check or enumerate applicable items. If there are 2 refrigerators that are in the home and your buyer wants both of those, you're going to write in the number 2. So that would happen in any place where that might pop up. Okay. So if you fill out the contract from the MLS, much of this is auto filled in. So when you go into the listing that you're selling and you click on the little contract icon, it will pop up The contract will be there and it will auto-fill into the contract. But you want to double check all of these personal property items, because the MLS and the sales contract are not, they're tied together, but not 100% identical in some cases. So you want to make sure that everything matches, even when it's auto-filled. I've heard occasions where people have written in, for example, in refrigerator, they'll write Sub-Zero after the refrigerator to make sure that the seller doesn't try to take that expensive one and replace it with a less expensive one. There is some place in the contract, and I will show it to you when we get there, that really does prohibit the seller from doing this. No harm or foul if you want to go ahead and write it in there. Same thing with oven, range, or stove, and you want to write what Viking or Meili or whatever it is after that. But there is another place where that is taken care of, and the seller would have to bring it back. So that's the standard things that are in the contract. But then line 29 has other items included at no added value. And just as a little aside, the reason for saying at no added value, both on line 15 and on line 29, what happens is that when the appraiser comes into the property, personal property can affect your appraised value. So what we're trying to say here is this is all part of the cost of the property. It's typical in our marketplace that this stuff stays, so it should be included in the appraised value. So we're trying, doesn't mean it's going to work, but we're going to give it our best shot. So line 29 is for your buyer to ask for other things. This can get scary. This is where buyers start to do things like asking for pool tables and riding lawnmowers and all the rest of that stuff. If your buyer wants that and you write it in and the seller is agreeing to leave it, do not be surprised when the seller comes back and says that those are going to be as is. When I sold my house, I left both the pool table and the riding mower, and I wrote in as is, because if I don't put in as is, then I have to make sure they're all working. And I will tell you honestly, I didn't know if that lawnmower was working. I didn't think there was anything wrong with the pool table, but I didn't know if the lawnmower was working at all. My husband had done that. My husband had passed away. I had no idea whether or not it was working. So don't be surprised to see that. Items not included, that's where the seller might write in. You as a buyer agent are probably going to put NA in there. Because that means that everything's included. But my seller may come back and say, we're not leaving the dining room chandelier. We're going to leave all the rest of the ceiling fans, all of the electrical, all of that's going to stay, except for my ceiling fan. So where it says light fixtures as they exist on line 19, third column over, you can leave that there if I put in exclude the dining room chandelier. Okay, now just a little hint, if you're the listing agent, you should have told your seller to take the darn chandelier down and go to Menards and put another one up so that we don't have to have these problems. Because we're supposed to be selling real estate, not a whole bunch of personal property, but it does happen. Okay. Then the seller warrants to buyer that everything, fixtures, systems, personal property, everything included in this contract shall be in operating condition at the possession except. And that's where a seller might, if the dishwasher isn't working or if something's not working, they could write in there except dishwasher. I want to remind you that FHA and VA and line 32 are not compatible. When you sell a property, FHA or VA, and your seller accepts an FHA or VA contract, you need to remember that everything has to be in working order. So there's no way you're going to be able to have it's not in working order if you're selling at FHA or VA. This is one of the first places where we start to talk to the buyer about the condition of things. We'll cover that more when we get into the home inspection paragraph, but it says at line 33, a system or an item shall be deemed to be in operating condition if it performs the function for which it is intended, regardless of age, and does not constitute a threat to health or safety. What that means is pretty obvious. If you buy a 25-year-old house And in this 25-year-old house has a 25-year-old roof. The roof is not leaking. Nothing is wrong with the roof. Then you don't get a new roof. If you bought a 15-year-old house and it's got a 15-year-old dishwasher in it and it's still washing dishes, it may not be a pot scrubber, but it's washing dishes, then you don't get a new dishwasher. So it's to let the buyers know they're getting what they see. It goes on at line 35 to say if a home warranty applies, we're going to check here, and then we've got another optional paragraph to fill out. And that's if the buyer wants the seller to provide a home warranty. If the buyer decides to do his own home warranty, you do not check that box. The buyer just pays for it himself. And what you need to keep in mind when you're doing all of this is, are you in a seller's market or are you in a buyer's market? If you are writing an offer on a property in a seller's market, adding extra things that the buyer wants, like pool tables and riding lawnmowers, asking for home warranties, asking for stuff the seller wasn't planning on leaving, is not the best idea you've ever had, because you're probably going to be in a multiple offer, and very likely you're going to end up losing the house because you just filled it up with a bunch of garbage. So you want to be careful. Now, the flip side of that is that this is a buyer's market. I should be preparing as a listing agent my seller for the fact that the buyers could be asking for more things. So it all depends on who's driving the bus. So that's basically how we use paragraph 3. So paragraph 4 then is the purchase price and the payment. Pretty straightforward. The purchase price is whatever the buyer is offering to the seller. And it goes on to talk about the legality of how all of it is going to be paid. In other words, after the payment of the earnest money, the balance of the purchase price is going to be paid at closing in good funds as defined by law. We don't need to worry about what good funds means. That's just to make sure that everybody knows that they can't bring in cattle and crops and all the rest of that stuff. So the next thing is credit at closing. And it says if applicable, and I'm going to piggyback here on my comment I just made about, is this a buyer's market or a seller's market? In a seller's market, the buyer asking for the seller to pay part of his closing costs is not going to get him very far in trying to get his offer accepted. There are times where your buyer needs that money in order to be able to afford the property. In other words, he's got his down payment, but he does not have all of his closing costs, he doesn't have the money to pay all of his closing costs. So if your buyer needs it, and if the buyer's lender permits the credit to happen, and if the lender says no, then it's still not going to happen. But that's where the seller is agreeing to credit X amount of dollars to the buyer at closing that will pay for expenses, closing costs, etc. So often we talk about closing costs or credit at closing as being a percentage of the sales price. So we do see that sometimes written in that way. Instead of a dollar amount, it might say 3 points. It's much clearer if you turn the points into a dollar amount, because that way there's no quarrel about how much it is the seller is going to be paying. If you are not using it, and I know it says if applicable, but I would still suggest, just to make everything perfectly clear, that you put my N/A in line 41 if the buyer is not asking for any credit at closing from the seller, okay? So the next part of this is, what is the earnest money going to be? The first thing I need to say is that you need to talk to your managing brokers about how much the earnest money should be. This contract is used for the entire greater Chicagoland area. And we have properties that marketplaces where the median sales price is $650,000 to $700,000, and other marketplaces where the median sales price is $150,000. How much earnest money is going to be required for those two marketplaces is drastically different. And it depends on the type of financing that you're using. So the earnest money that the buyer is putting up to show the seller that he really wants to purchase this property is what goes in the blank, the first blank on line 42. The second blank is where it says this earnest money shall be tendered to the escrowee on or before blank business days after the date of acceptance. So if I were to write this contract, I might say that I'm going to earnest money of $3,000 shall be tendered to the escrowee on or before 3 business days after the date of acceptance. That means that I or my buyer must make sure that we have delivered to whoever is holding the earnest money that $3,000 by the date in this contract. If it is not delivered by that date, then you have the problem of your buyer being in default. So you want to make sure that the date you put in there is something that your buyer can live with. If you put it out too far, you're going to have to be concerned, well, not concerned, but you are very likely to get a counteroffer back because generally speaking, we don't see that date in there of anything longer than 5 business days after the date of acceptance. Typically, the reason most buyer agents will put that in there is when we get to the home inspection and the attorney modification paragraph, you will see that there is a 5 business day time frame for those 2 things to be done. And usually by the end of that 5 days, we have a pretty good handle on whether or not this thing is going to stay together. Then we have additional earnest money, if any. You do not have to have 2 batches of earnest money, but you could have. So if I said I'm going to give you $1,000 worth of earnest money in 5 business days, and let's just say this is a $300,000 house we're selling, that's not going to be enough earnest money. So I would then possibly say I will bring you an additional, 3,000 more, or 2,000, or 5, whatever your managing broker says is appropriate, in blank by a certain date, not blank number of days, but by a certain date. And often what we put in there is 15 days roughly after I've written this contract. Because again, this ties in with the 5 business days to do the home inspection and the attorney modification, and then 5 business days to take care of any issues that came up the first 5 days. Now we have 10 business days plus the weekends. And what I'm saying is I'll give you the 1,000 now. I'm going to bring you the other 5,000 or whatever it is after we've satisfied all of the attorney modification, etc. I recommend strongly that you do not put in additional earnest money of 5,000 shall be tendered and then do something weird in there and write in after AI is satisfied. AI means attorney review, home inspection. So don't write in after AI, because there are times we go all the way to the closing and the AI has never been what we call satisfied. So you want to put a date in there. If we're not done with the attorney review and the home inspection by the date in line 44, then the buyer's attorney will just extend it or ask for an extension, and typically it's extended. So, but at least it gets us with some firm dates of when the earnest money is coming in while we're negotiating the contract. All right, so this paragraph does go on to the next page, and at the top, this is continuation of the earnest money paragraph. It talks about here at line 45, who is going to be holding this earnest money. So typically in our marketplace in the greater Chicagoland area where this contract is used, the earnest money is held by the seller's brokerage. It is a mandatory field in MRED, our MLS, that the listing agent needs to put in there that the earnest money will be held, whether or not they hold earnest money. So you're in the MLS, you're selling my listing, and I do hold earnest money, then you're just going to check seller's brokerage. Your buyer will be making his earnest money check out to the listing office then, and that's where it gets delivered. That's where it needs to be tendered. If in fact the seller's brokerage does not hold earnest money, you then, and your office does, you check buyer's brokerage, and then you hold the earnest money. If neither of us do, then we have the option of checking the third box, which is as otherwise agreed by the parties as escrowee, and that means as otherwise agreed by the parties. You and I can continue to negotiate this contract when neither one of us holds earnest money, because we don't need to worry about it right now. We can sell a house this weekend and we can figure out on Monday whether or not we're going to have a title company hold it, or if it's going to be held by the seller's attorney, or who exactly is going to hold it. No worries right now. Although I will say that if you're going to check box number 3, it is generally suggested that you put back on the how many business days to deliver the earnest money, that you put 5 business days in there. Because if you don't even know who's going to hold it and you sell the house on Saturday, you better figure you've got maybe a day or two, Monday or Tuesday, to figure out who's going to hold it. And then you need time for you or your buyer to get that earnest money delivered to whomever is going to hold it. So in the event the contract is declared null and void, or it's terminated for any reason, the earnest money is going to be dispersed pursuant to paragraph 26. And we'll get to paragraph 26, but that is the paragraph that says what happens to the earnest money if the contract is declared null and void. We needed to reference that here so that the buyers and sellers all understand. For example, we cannot return earnest money without joint written direction of the parties. And the buyers need to know that, and the sellers need to know that they're probably not supposed to be hanging on to the buyer's earnest money if the buyer deserves to get it back. So that was just to kind of point them in the right direction so that they know what happens to the earnest money. The balance due at closing is no big deal. Again, it's more of a legal thing that says that everything has to be paid in good funds at the closing, and we kind of mentioned that just a little bit before. So that's the remainder of the paragraph that has to do with the purchase price and the earnest money. So that brings us then to paragraph 5, and that's the closing. So you're the buyer agent. When does your buyer want to close on this transaction? And you're going to see in just a couple of minutes that there are 45 days after the date of acceptance to get the mortgage, or 5 business days prior to the date of closing. But the issue here is that often the sellers aren't even wanting to close before about 60 days. Your buyer's usually not ready to close before about 60 days, but you need to talk to the lender, because if you're trying to close, and I'm going to give you some statistics in just a couple of minutes, if you're trying to close much before about 50 days from the date of this contract, you could be aiming for a target you can't hit. So just to share with you, Ellie Mae is one of those groups that keeps track of a lot of stuff that's going on with loans. And and this is the beginning of January. Just this past couple of weeks, they brought out their survey that they gave of the average days to close a transaction. So I will tell you that the average days to close a conventional transaction was 47 days. The average days to close an FHA was 48, and a VA was 50. Now that was for the last month. The lowest days in all of 2018 was 42 days on a conventional, 43 days on an FHA, and 46 days on a VA. So all the times that people are saying we're going to close in 30 days, you better make sure that the lender is pulling in some favors someplace along the way, because it sometimes is almost impossible, especially on an FHA or a VA, to get the thing closed within 30 days. A lot of that has to do with the time it takes to get the appraisal done. So FYI, talk to your buyers. When do they want to close? But don't be unrealistic about your closing date is my point. So it goes on in this paragraph to say that we are going to close this transaction at whatever title insurance company that they're going to use, whichever of those title companies is situated nearest to the real estate. And that's to hopefully keep us from having to go to the other ends of the earth, so to speak, to do a closing. So we're going to do this as close to the property as we possibly can. We have no control over this, by the way. This is all done by the attorneys and the title companies. So, but it's in there to try to rein in a little bit that the attorneys aren't making us drive to downtown Chicago when the house is in Aurora. That's the attempt, okay? So the next paragraph is the possession paragraph. And unless we're going to use the optional paragraph 35, which is this post-closing possession, meaning the seller is going to stay in the house after the closing, the seller is going to deliver possession to the buyer at the closing. So they're going to go to the closing, your buyer's going to get the keys, and they're going to be able to move in. I will be honest and say to you that there's a couple of times where the seller will say our moving trucks are still there, but you probably figured that out because you saw that on the walkthrough. You might have to go to lunch first, but they're going to get possession that day. And possession is delivered when the seller and all of the occupants, if any, have vacated the real estate and delivered the keys to the buyer. So if there's a tenant in the property, this contract says that that tenant also has to be out of that property in order to give possession. If the seller cannot give possession, then the seller's in default of the contract. So when we're a listing agent and we've listed a property that has a tenant in there, we need to make sure that the seller understands that the tenant has to vacate the property prior to the closing. The exception to that would be my investor buying your investor's property and he wants the tenant to stay, but that's not generally what happens, okay? This is generally what happens is they need to be what? They need to be out. Everybody's out so the buyer can move in.